A long, long time ago, before there were plants or oceans or stars or even our planet Earth was here, there was nothing. Just deep, dark space. Try to imagine that deep, dark space. It was darker than the darkest night you have ever seen. The cold was bitter cold, colder than ice. Out of this nothingness came a dark, heavy mass, no bigger than a speck of dust. It floated for a long time in the emptiness. And then one day, the mass exploded, and out came all that we know of the universe. It exploded with unimaginable power, and it grew, and all those specks of dust and started going away from each other, and some particles were attracted to each other and came together, and some particles were repelled and went away from each other. That nebular cloud of elements and particles moved through space, and one of those particles became our sun, and one of those particles became our Earth. But our Earth was a red ball of fire, elements, gases, and heat. The elements on the outer edge of the ball began to dance. They were hot, and they would rise up, and as they rose up, they would go out into the atmosphere, and they would come back down and cool off. And they would get hot because our Earth was a big ball of fire, and they would start to rise up, cool off, and come down again. And this is considered the dance of the elements. There were a couple things at this time that were happening during the dance of the elements. As they danced for hundreds of thousands of millions of years, when they settled by weight. And so that when the elements and things settled, they might have settled first. The heavy things settled and attracted other elements that were a little lighter and would float on top of it. Thus, the heavier elements would be in the middle of our planet, and the lighter things would float to the top. So besides the heaviest things going to the bottom with the lighter things coming on top, there was yet another rule to follow. Some particles were attracted to each other while others were not. So they started to form groups. So the first group formed very, very tight bonds and were very close together. These were the solids. The second group of particles liked to be together or would stay together, but they also weren't as tightly held together as the solids. This would be our liquids. Our final group of particles, due mostly to the heat, like to be further away from each other. And so they were not held tightly together, although they still formed an element. These elements are the gases or the air. So depending on how close the bonds were of each of our particles, they either formed a solid, a liquid, or a gas. So as we were speaking, we had the dance of the elements. The heavier things were going to the middle of the earth, the lighter things were at the crust of the earth. We had different elements forming, solids, liquids, and gases, but things started cooling down, and as they cooled down, a crust started forming on top of the earth. And the earth began to take shape. And the elements inside the earth were still very hot, and they were trapped. Just like all laws of the universe, they had to follow the laws of the universe, and when something is hot, it needs to expand, and so it expanded. So these particles pushed out and broke the skin of the earth. The water that had been on the surface became so hot that it turned to water vapor, and up went the gases. The volcanoes were erupting and spewing steam and ash. So eventually, everything cooled down, and the hot steam from the volcanoes turned to rain. And the rain filled the hollows and the craters of our earth and turned into the oceans. The earth was still filled with gases and didn't sustain life, but changes were continuing and things were going to change soon as the bacteria came to visit.